Okay, so our series is Man Made in the Image of God, and our first talk tonight is man's place in the hierarchy of creation. And we'll also look at our ways of knowing and our sense knowledge. And so there are really two topics here. Our place in the hierarchy of God's creation and our sense knowledge. And then next week, we'll look at what sets man apart, which is our intellectual knowledge, our reason. And as I mentioned, in the series, we'll look at man in the natural order. And next, in the fall, we'll look at man elevated by grace to the supernatural order. Okay, so let's begin by reflecting on man's place in creation. Now, most of us, I think, tend to flatter ourselves that we're the highest. That man's place in creation, well, that's obvious. We're the best. We're the top. And that's profoundly false. It's not true. We're not at the top. We're, in fact, right in the middle of creation. Why is that? Because we're the top of one half of creation, the physical creation, but we're the bottom of the other invisible half of creation, the spiritual creation, which includes the angels. It includes, we don't know, but myriads and myriads of angels above us. And so we're not at the top. In fact, we have a unique place in the hierarchy of creation, a beautiful place, smack in the middle. We could say the intersection of the physical universe and the spiritual universe. And this is beautifully brought forth in Revelation. Psalm number 8 has beautiful words about man's place in creation. The psalmist says, he marvels, "What is man that thou art mindful of him?" That God is mindful of us. "Or the Son of Man that thou visitest him? Thou hast made him a little less than the angels. Thou hast crowned him with glory and honor, and hast set him over the work of thy hands. Thou hast subjected all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, moreover the beasts also of the fields, the birds of the air and the fishes of the sea that pass through the paths of the sea. O Lord our Lord, O Lord our God, how admirable is thy name in all the earth." And then so the psalm beautifully shows us our place in the cosmos. Higher than all the beasts, but a little lower than the angels. And so we've got a central position. The position of intersection of the material and spiritual worlds, and thus the highest of bodily creatures, but the lowest of spiritual creatures. And this is the profound sense of why man is said in the classical tradition to be a microcosm. Microcosm means a little cosmos, a little universe. Man is a little universe because we have in us both orders of what God created. We have in us a little bit of everything. We have in our bodies the perfection of the physical universe. And we have in our souls a part of the spiritual universe. And so in that sense, we're a little universe unto ourselves, uniting in ourselves all the different parts of God's universe. Now, modern man has lost this sense of our place in creation. This is a huge problem in the world today. People don't recognize our place. And I think part of that is because we've lost any sense of the existence of a spiritual world, of a world of angels. And because of that, we tend to fall into one of two opposite errors. There's a more common error, which is materialism, denying any spiritual world at all. And then there's another kind of error, less common, but still dangerous, which is a kind of angelism. So materialism and angelism. Angelism would be thinking of man as if we were an angel, in a certain sense. And this comes from the philosopher Descartes. Descartes thought of man as two things: a spiritual thing, a thinking thing, and an extended thing, a body, as if we were two. As if through our thought we were like an angel, but an angel somehow stuck in a body, which we can't explain why. And the problem with that is it loses the profound union of body and soul in man. And we'll talk more about that later on. So we want to avoid both of those errors: materialism, which denies the spiritual soul, but angelism or dualism that denies the fact that we're bodily, that we're rational animals. And we'll talk more about that. The proper definition of man is a rational animal. And we see in that definition both orders. As animals, we belong to the physical universe, but as rational animals, we belong to the spiritual universe. And yet we're one, we're not two. Right? We're not two things. We're not a soul that somehow, fell into a body by accident. Yeah. But our body's an essential part of who we are. Okay. Let's look now at the levels of life. Again, with the idea of seeing our place in the universe. Now, common sense experience of the world shows us that everything that God made has, we could say, a hierarchy, has levels of being. And the most beautiful way to see this, I think, is to go to the zoo. In the zoo, we see the animals in the zoo form a kind of hierarchy. That there are higher animals and lower animals. And it would be a mistake to think, that insects were on the same level as zebras. That would be ridiculous. And so we see that there are levels of life with higher beings and lower beings. And so we can classify life into three realms. The realm of the plants, the realm of irrational animals, and then rational creatures. So human beings and angels. And above those three, there's God, who also is alive. He's the living God. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. All right, so, let's start with that. Does God have life? Right? Scripture tells us that God is not just endowed with life, but is the life. Right? He is, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So what does that mean, that God is life? St. Thomas Aquinas asks that question, and he answers it by saying that life is essentially self-movement. Right? A living thing is one that moves itself. But there are all kinds of grades of self-movement. And to see how God is life, we have to look at how plants are life, how brute animals are life, how man has life, and God has it supremely. And so the idea is the more perfect the life, the more perfect the self-movement. Now, things without life, like rocks, can't move themselves at all. They can move, but only if they're moved by another. And so that's why we think that they're inanimate. They don't move themselves. But plants do move themselves. And that's what's so marvelous, is that a tree, it grows by itself. And it doesn't have to be built up by an artisan. It has a principle of life within it by which it grows, by which it nourishes itself, and by which it reproduces itself. Right? And so we can call that self-movement. All right, we usually think of movement as going from place to place. But let's take movement in a broad sense of change. And so growth is a kind of movement. It's a beautiful kind of movement. And nourishment also, and above all, reproduction. To pass on one's life to another. But in all of those operations, the plant is merely executing a design written into it by God, by nature. And so, yes, the plant moves itself, growing and nourishing itself and reproducing, but simply carrying out a plant written into its DNA, right, that it has no control over. A higher level of life is that of the animals, the brute animals. And they have everything that the plant does. The animal grows, nourishes itself, and reproduces. But in addition, it senses. It knows things through its senses. And because of those senses, it can seek out its own food. In other words, it can move itself based on its own knowledge. The plant can't do that. No, it just grows according to the laws of nature written into it. But the animal take the lion. It sees its prey and it chases it and eats it. And so it acts on the basis of its own operation of seeing or smelling or hearing. And so it moves itself more than the plant. And that's why it's a higher level of life. And because it can do that, it has locomotion. It can move itself from place to place to get its food that it sees or smells. But it's not a total self-mover because it's acting according to instinct that's put into it by God. And so the lion can't change the fact that it's hungry. Right? If the lion's hungry, it's going to seek food no matter what. It can't decide to fast because it's Lent or something like that. And so the animals move themselves, but according, again, to an instinct put into it by God, over which they don't have control. And the same thing would go for all the other things that the animals do. They make these, right, the birds that make these nests. It's unbelievable. But they make them according to an instinct, put into them by God, and they can't not make them. And they can't not make them that way. They can't think, well, I could make another kind of nest with other kinds of twigs, with a different kind of shape for a change. Right? You'll never find a bird making a different kind of nest for variety. And so there's a higher level of life, that of man, the rational animal, we can move ourselves in a much more perfect way because and we'll talk more about this next week and the following, because our reason and our will, through our intellect, we can know a universal, like house. And then we can, with our reason, think of different ways that we could build a house. And so we don't have to build it this way. We could build it that way, or some other way, or some third completely different way. And even more importantly, we can know our end, happiness, and we can seek it this way with one kind of life, or seek it in another way with a totally different kind of life. And so man is free, not just to execute operations as the animal, but he's free to choose the operations he wants to execute. And so we have a much more self-movement than any animal. Right? Because the animals, they can't choose the ends that they act for. They have to build nests. They have to spin webs. And they can't even choose the kind of web that they're going to spin. Right? But we can choose all of those things. And above all of that, we can choose the path to happiness. Choosing one kind of life or another. Choosing one state of life or another state of life. Choosing marriage or celibacy. Right? The animal can't do that. But, so one might think, okay, well, we have total self-movement. Right? We're the ultimate self-movers. But if you think about it, there's one thing that we don't determine ourselves to. And that's seeking happiness. And determining what is really happiness. We can pick a way that we think leads to happiness, but we might be wrong. But we don't actually get to pick what is our true final end, because God's picked it for us. So God gives us the desire for happiness. We don't give that to ourselves. And He is that happiness, whether we like it or not, whether we seek it or not. And so we don't totally move ourselves. We can move ourselves only insofar as God first moves us to desire happiness, which He ultimately is. Right? Since that happiness lies in union with Him. And so God has a higher life. He moves Himself to do everything that He does, like create the world and everything in it. And He does so not seeking some other end outside of Himself, but simply communicating His own goodness, because His goodness is good. In other words, ultimately, for the sake of His own goodness that He wants to share to us. And so God is the life in the highest possible way. Okay, another way that we could look at the grades. So in those grades of life, we're higher than the plants and the animals, but less than, obviously, infinitely less than God. Let's look now at another kind of grades of life. Another way to look at the grades of life is by interiority. An inanimate thing, like a rock, has no interior life, obviously, because it has no life at all. It has no real interior, the rock. But we have an interior life, no? We say that, and hopefully we develop it. So what do we mean by that? In order to understand this, I'm going to have to introduce some terminology. I'm going to apologize. But it's very helpful to distinguish two kinds of actions. And we'll be using this in the later lectures. There's one kind of action that philosophers call transitive, which is when you make something outside of yourself. You make an exterior product, like an architect makes a house, or a sculptor makes a statue, a painter makes a painting. And the thing that you make is outside of you. Or a batter hits a baseball, and the baseball goes outside of himself. That's a transitive action. But there's another kind of action which we call immanent, or we could say interior. An interior action in which the product, remains inside. It doesn't go anywhere. It remains in the subject. Right? And that's really what makes you a subject, is that a subject is one who has an interior in which something can remain. And an example of this is when we know something. Right? If we know an idea, justice, that idea is inside of us. It's in our spirit. It's in our mind. Right? It didn't go away. Or even when we see something, what we see, sure, the thing that we see is outside, but our seeing it is inside, and we can retain that in our memory. And so we call that an immanent operation. It stays inside. And another example of this is when we love someone. The person that we love is outside, but our act of loving is interior. It's an immanent operation. It stays, the loving is in us, and we're changed by it. We're not the same person after we love someone than before we did. Just as we're different when we come to know something that previously we didn't know. And that's why a person, when they come to faith, they're changed by that faith because they've been enriched by having that knowledge about God inside that previously they didn't have. And that's what makes up interior life. That we have these actions that we do whose fruit stays inside us. And that's proper to living things. Only living things can do that. But there are grades. Right? The plant does something that stays inside, but not very much. Right? So when the plant grows, okay, but the growth stays inside. That growth is, right, it's the same plant who's now been nourished and grows. And then it brings forth a fruit. But what happens then? Then the fruit separates. And so it started out inside, but it separated and went outside. And so it started immanent, but ended up transitive. So there's a little bit of interior life in animals. Just growth, nourishment, and reproduction. In plants. Animals have higher, right? Because the animal senses, and its sensing stays inside, and it can remember. Now, the higher animals, there are higher animals and lower animals. The lower animals, like insects, you can't train them, or hardly at all, probably not at all, because they don't remember their experiences, so that they could learn from them. Whereas the higher animals can learn, and thus they can interiorize more. Right? And so they have more interiority, more immanent action. So when an animal, a dog who learns its master and has affection for its master, learns to recognize them, that's something interior in the dog. Right? And that's beautiful. That's a higher thing. But man, the rational animal, has so much more interior life. And so in man, we can have an interior fruit that's completely spiritual. Now in the animal, right, it sees its prey and it can remember. But it can't reflect on itself, the animal. The animal is never going to stop and think, what kind of an animal am I? Etc. Am I good? Who am I? What am I for? It can't ask any of those questions about itself. And so it has something interior, but not complete. No, something partial interior. Whereas man, not only can we produce something that stays inside, our knowledge and our love, but we can reflect on our own acts. Right? And so when we know something, we know that we know it. Right? And we know that we know that we know. And we could go on and on. And the same thing happens in our will. That we love something, say we love God, and we love to love. And the same thing goes for our spouses and children. Right? We love them, and we love to love them. And we can desire to desire, etc. So our spiritual actions are so much interior that we can we keep them and we can reflect on them, and we can act on our own acting inside. And that's what we call interior life, reflecting on our own being and on the source of our being, God. Now in God, there's interior life in an infinitely higher way. Because like us, God knows himself, but his knowing of himself, by when we know ourselves, that we produce inside a kind of a thought, a concept, an idea of ourselves. What happens when God knows himself? God knowing himself generates the second person of the Trinity. That's what the second person of the Trinity is the Word of God, the Son of God, and he's begotten precisely as the perfect Word that perfectly expresses everything that God is. So God knowing himself, he's infinitely fruitful, and he produces a word, and that word isn't something outside of him, as if something, a creature. No, that word is so interior that it is him. Anyway, we would need more time to explain that properly. And the same thing happens when God loves himself. The Father and the Son have a mutual love, and that love is fruitful, right? Just as when we love another, we're changed by that love. And we can even experience that when we love someone. How are we changed? Well, we have inside ourselves a kind of self-gift to the person that we love. And we'll talk more about this later, but artists and cultures represents love simply as Cupid's arrow. And that's a beautiful figure of love, because that's what love does. It shoots us, as it were, to our beloved. Love is a kind of impetus leading us to the beloved. In the divine life, the love of the Father and the Son is infinitely fruitful. It breathes forth an impetus of divine love, which is the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity. And it's interior. It's not a creature. It's interior to the divine life. It's God, that breath of love in the divine life. And so God too has immanent or interior operations that are infinitely fruitful. Right? We could say God has an infinite interior life, which is the life of the Trinity. Okay. Now let's go back down to earth. Living things on earth, bodily living things, but also angels. When we're living things because we move ourselves, right? And we have different kinds of activities that we could call self-moving activities, vital activities: growing, nourishment, reproduction, locomotion, sense knowledge. All of those activities, we say, come forth from a faculty. So we have a faculty of sight. We have a faculty of locomotion, a power. We have the power to move. We have the power to see. We have the power of nourishment, of reproduction. And so every living thing has to have some kind of faculty by which it does its living operations. And there's a hierarchy of these faculties. And so the lowest faculties are vegetative faculties that plants have: nourishment, growth, and reproduction. And then above that, animals have faculties to sense things. And so our 5 external senses are faculties and powers. And then locomotion, to move from place to place, is a faculty of animals. And then animals also have appetite, to desire, say, nourishment, to hate what's harmful to their life. And we'll talk more about this later on. And man also has all of those faculties. But above them all, he has rational faculties. That's reason and will. Right? So we've got, we have, let's put it like this. The plant has the most basic. It has three vital activities: nourishment, growth, reproduction. The animal has those too, right? Because he too nourishes himself, grows, and reproduces. But in addition, he adds on more faculties. He's got all his five senses, and he has appetite and movement. Now, man has all of that. He has what's proper to a plant, he has what's proper to an animal, and in addition, we have something that the plants and animals don't have: reason and will. And so, we're the most complex. We have the most... Now, we sometimes think, I don't know, a computer is more complex. But we're infinitely more complex than a computer. Not infinitely, immeasurably more complex. The computer can't do any of those things. Doesn't have any faculties. Doesn't have any self-movement at all. You've got to push it. You've got to press the buttons, etc. It only does what one part moves another. But so man has the most faculties. And above us, the angels have less. They only have two faculties: intellect and will. And so it's as if in the world, the lowest things, inanimate things, are the simplest. And then the higher you go in the physical world, the more complex, the greater the number of operations and faculties. And we're the highest. But then in the spiritual world, it's the other way around. The higher you go in the spiritual world, what happens? The simpler you get. So the angels are simpler than man. And in the spiritual world, that's better. In the physical world, it's worse. Right? It's worse to be simple in the physical world, like like quartz or something, like a mineral. Like that's lower because you can't. And the reason for that is because matter is a principle of limitation. So a simple material thing can't move itself. It just sits there. Whereas, so in the physical world, greater complexity is better. But in the spiritual world, simplicity is better because God is totally simple. And so we're right in the middle, and that's why we're the most complex of all of creation. Right? So to be complex, it's both good and bad. It's good in the physical order, but it's bad in the spiritual order. And this is why if you go to spiritual direction and you speak with your director and he says, "Ooh, how complicated," that's not a good sign. Right? That means that our life is not simply ordered to God. Right? So in the spiritual life, we want to be simple, to have one end, and to order everything to that end. But generally, we're not like that, no? Generally, we're complicated. We're going in all different directions, and that's not good. St. Thomas gives an analogy for man's place in the world. He gives an analogy with medicine. And so let's think of four types of beings. One kind of being who could get a little health with few remedies. And then someone else who could get complete health, or much better health, but with many medicines. And then a third who could get that same good health, but with few medicines, or few remedies. And then a fourth who has perfect health and needs nothing. Right? Obviously, the fourth is the best, that's God. The one who can have the perfect life, but needing few things, that would be the angels. We who can have that fullness, but we need many remedies, many faculties, many operations. And then the creatures below us that can only have a tiny, a very low perfection, but they need little for that. Right? So it's better to be very dependent, but still to be able to attain happiness. It would be better still if we could attain that happiness with less, if we were less dependent. And obviously the best would be to be that happiness, and that's God alone. Okay. Now, of all these faculties that we have, all of them require the body except for two, except for our intellect and will. And that's why we call them spiritual faculties, our intellect and will. And we'll show that in the fourth talk. We'll talk more about what it means to be spiritual. But all the rest of our faculties always have to work together with our body. And that's why we need to keep our body healthy, to be able to do all the actions that require both a body and a soul. Okay. Now, there's one final way that we can look at man's place in creation, and that's according to the openness. The higher the creature, the more open it is to things outside itself. The lower the creature, the more closed in on itself it is. And so a rock is not open at all, right? It has no openness. It's inanimate. Animals, to a certain extent, they incorporate other things into themselves through nourishment, and they reproduce, and thus there's some openness in the animal, minimal. Animals have more. They're open through their senses. Right? So through their senses, they can sense things outside of themselves and desire them and move to them and take them in and eat them or mate with them. Right? And so the animal has much more openness through having senses. Right? And so sense life is much more noble than vegetative life, right? Because it's more open to the world. Well, man, the rational animal, is so much more open, because not only the animal can know only particular things, the particular things that it encounters. Right? And so the lion knows its particular prey here and now. But animals can never go beyond the here and now. And so they're open, yes, but they're limited by here and now. Whereas man is not. Right? Through our intellect, we can know not just what's here and now, but we can know, say, beauty as a universal. We can know the idea of beauty or justice or whatever it is. Or even simply on the physical realm, we can know not just this pig or this dog or whatnot, but we can know pigs, dogs, animals, creatures in all their extension. And so man, through our intellect, we're open to all being. Right? We're open to everything. We come into the world blank, with a blank slate, but it's open without any limit. It's open to all being. And that's why we can receive even the being of God in heaven, because our intellects are opened. Whereas an animal can't receive God, because it's only open to particulars, bodily particulars, other bodily creatures. And so it's not open to God. And so the rational creature has so much more extension. And Aristotle understood this, even though he didn't have the aid of revelation. And he refers to the human soul as, he says, in some way the soul is all things, because we can know all things. Right? We're not actually all things, but we're potentially all things through knowledge. We can know the forms of all things. And the same thing goes for our will. An animal, through its desire, it can desire particular things, right? So that the lion can desire its prey. The cat can desire its cat food. The dog can desire the attention of its master. But it's always a particular, right? It's this cat food. It's the dog's this master. Whereas we can desire goodness without limit. We can desire truth without any limit. And in fact, we necessarily desire goodness without limit. And we call it happiness. And everybody on earth desires it. We may think that it consists in something that's totally wrong. But we all desire total goodness. And so you can see that our wills too are open. They're totally open to everything, to all goodness. And that's the source of the nobility of man. Right? That we're open to all truth and our wills are open to all goodness. And we naturally desire to be filled with that goodness. And we can't help it. Even though we may seek it in totally disordered places. Okay. All right, let's look now at our sense knowledge. And before that, let's just ask, what is knowledge? Now, we use that word every day, but if we stop to ask ourselves, what do we mean by knowledge? Can I define knowledge? We might, well, probably, we'll find ourselves unable to explain what we mean. Right? What do we mean by knowledge? And it has to do with what we were just talking about, openness. So it seems to me that knowledge is the ability to take in the form of another being, to take it into ourselves as other. In other words, to know another, to have the form of another thing in me, so that I'm open to that being that's outside of myself. In other words, knowledge is a kind of enrichment. It's taking in, enriching my being with other beings. I don't take the whole being into me. I just take the form into me. I leave the matter, the body, outside. So knowing is like possessing the form of objects without their matter. Right? It's a way of taking the world into ourselves. And that's how we're open to the world. Now, how do we do that? Well, that's totally mysterious, how we do that. The ancient philosophers, and we call them the pre-Socratic. Pre-Socratic means before Socrates. So the philosophers of ancient Greece, before Socrates, tried to explain knowledge in a materialistic kind of way, which is comical, but there's a grain of truth in it. Empedocles was the philosopher who did this. He reasoned when we know something, we receive something of that thing into ourselves. All right. So he thought, well, we must be receiving like a miniature. So if I know a pig, what would be happening? It's as if I would be receiving like a miniature pig into me, so that I could know the pig. Or if I know iron, I must be receiving a little pellet, a minuscule pellet of iron into me. Now, obviously, this is false, but there's something true in it, and it's the idea that knowing involves receiving the object. Right? We can't know anything if we don't receive what we know. But obviously, we don't receive the bodies of all things, because if we were doing that, then we would be eating, or that would be nourishment. But we receive them spiritually, not physically. Right? And so in knowledge, we're receiving somehow the form of the thing that we know, but the matter stays out there in the world. Because knowing isn't simply ingesting. It's a kind of spiritual ingesting. Right? And so Aristotle corrected Empedocles. He was right that knowing is taking something in. But he didn't distinguish form from matter. Form is what makes a thing be what it is. And the matter is we could say the substrate that receives the form, but can lose that form and get another form. So, I don't know, a piece of wood. It can lose the form of wood and get another form, the form of ashes. Yeah. And the matter stays there, but one form came and another one was lost. And it seems that when we know things, we take the form, but not the matter. And we'll talk more about how we do that next time. Now, here I'm going to have to make a philosophical distinction. There are two kinds of forms. There are what we call accidental forms, like I'm 5 feet tall, I have a certain color, a certain smell, a certain sound. And we call this accidental because they can change and I'm still who I am. So a baby is 1 foot and then 2 feet and then 3 feet, but it's still the same person. And so the essence is one thing, and what's accidental is another thing. We'll come back to this. And so there's one kind of form that we say is accidental that can change. For example, color, size, smell. And there's another kind of form that makes a thing be what it is. Say humanity. So the baby has humanity, and the full-grown man has that same essence of humanity. And that's what makes a human being to be a human being. And we can, with our senses, we know the accidental forms of things. For example, with our eyes, we know the colors of things. With our ears, we hear the sounds of things. With our hands, we touch the textures of things. Those are all accidental things. But with our intellect, what do? We grasp the essence of things. And we can say, that's a dog, that's a bird, that's a pear. And that's grasping the form in a higher sense. But in either case, we're enriching ourselves by taking in something from the outside. Right? So our senses take in accidental forms, colors, sounds, textures, size, and our intellect takes in essences, what a thing is. Right? In both ways, we're open to the world. We're taking in forms from the world, but we're taking in two kinds of forms. Changeable accidental forms and essences. Okay, we'll talk about our intellect next week, how we know what a thing is. But let's talk a little bit about our senses. So, our senses take in particulars, they take in particular things, right, that we somehow come into some kind of contact with. And we distinguish our senses according to the kind of object that they take in. So our sight takes in color, our hearing takes in sound, our smell takes in odor, our taste takes in the tastes of things, and our touch takes in the texture and hot and cold. And so we've got 5 different senses because they take in 5 different kinds of objects, 5 different kinds of forms. And so there's one sense for each type of thing we can take in. So each one of our senses is limited. It only takes in that one type of form. Right? So our sight only takes in color. It leaves everything else out there. Right? It can only take in color. Our hearing only takes in sound. Our smell only takes in odor. Right? So they're like windows into the world, but they're partial windows. No, they're limited windows. They only take in one type of reality, and they only take in particular things in that kind of reality. So with my eyes, I can't see color. I can only see this color, or that other color. In other words, I can only take in particular colors. And with my hearing, I can take in particular sounds. And with smell, we take in particular odors. So they're like these windows onto the world. But in all of them, we're taking in the form, but not the matter. Right? So with the color, we grasp the colors of things, but the things stay outside. Okay. And that's easy, I think, the 5 external senses. We learn that in school. But there are other senses that are important that we don't learn about in school so much, which philosophers call internal senses, which are tremendously important for human life. So let's look at this. Animals, too, have these internal senses. And we call them internal because there's not a sense organ that's open to the outside for these internal senses. They have an organ, the brain, that's windowless. Right? The brain doesn't have any gateway to the world. It's the organ of our internal senses, the brain. And what are these internal senses? Well, the first one is what we call the unifying sense. And the idea is simple. Let's just imagine honey. We see it as golden. We touch it, it's sticky. We taste it, it's sweet. And we can smell it, it smells like honey. And yet, we don't see it as 4 different things, but as one thing. In other words, we grasp it in a unity, in a synthetic way. We put together our 5 external senses, and we grasp objects as unities. Right? So, or sugar. We see something that's white, we can feel its texture, we taste it as sweet, we can hear it falling or something, and we grasp it as one thing. Right? And there's a sense that's doing that, that's unifying, and it's in the brain. Right? So we could call it the unifying sense. And it's through this unifying sense that we have some kind of sensory consciousness, that we have some awareness of the world as made up of objects, and not just a kind of chaos. Right? So we have this unifying sense, and so do animals. And in addition to it, we have a higher internal sense, that's the imagination. And animals also have it in a lower kind of way. And we can see that in the fact that animals seek things that aren't present. The external senses only get what's present, right? So with the eyes, a lion can only see what's present. And he can only hear what's actually making noise. Now he can only smell what's present. But with the imagination, he can imagine something that he doesn't have and seek it out. Right? So the bird that wants to make a nest and seeks out the twigs, because he must have some image in his imagination of the twig that he needs, so that he seeks it. Yeah. Now, and we too have this ability to imagine things that aren't present. But in man, it's so much higher because we have free will and reason. And so we can not only imagine things that aren't present, but we can recombine them. We can play with them. Right? And that's what artists do. They play with the forms that we've taken in the past, and we recombine them, and we play with them, as it were, directing them to new purposes. Right? And that's what makes art and creativity possible. Right? And the organ of that is the brain. And so if the brain is damaged, our ability to imagine will be damaged. Okay. So that's our second interior sense. And there's a third interior sense that's still more important for human life and even for the animals. And we can see this, we can call it the sense of value. By value here, I don't mean ethical value. I mean simply the value for life. And the cat, seeing its cat food. It doesn't, what does the cat grasp when it sees the cat food? It doesn't just see, brown, or whatever color the cat food is. Or it doesn't just smell some particular smell. It grasps that this is good for it. And when the sheep sees a wolf, it doesn't just see, brown, a brown shape. But it grasps that the wolf is bad for it, is dangerous. Even though it has no notion of an abstract thing like danger. But it grasps that this particular thing, this wolf, is bad for it. And so it runs. And how does it do this? Well, it's mysterious, no? And we call it instinct. And instinct comes from the Latin meaning impulse, inspiration. So an instinct is something that's, as it were, put into the animal so that it will be able to grasp the values of things for them, whether it's harmful or beneficial. Whether it's good to eat or something dangerous. And it's always particular. So the animal, it's not going to be able to explain that wolves are bad, because that would require reason. We'll talk about that next week. But the animal knows in the particular, this is bad. But it doesn't know bad, because bad is universal. We can't imagine what animal consciousness would be like. Because whenever we think to ourselves, we're using universal concepts, and animals don't have them. But nevertheless, they can grasp that particular things are good, and that's why they seek them, and other things are bad for them, and they flee from them. Right? And that's marvelous. That's a sense. It's a kind of sense knowledge, but it comes from within. Right? They don't grasp that the wolf is bad because, the wolf looks ugly. They grasp that the wolf is bad for it because they know by nature it's implanted within them. It's an interior sense. Now we have that too, but we have it in a much higher way. And so St. Thomas, when he speaks about this, St. Thomas Aquinas, he gives it a different name. He calls it the cogitative sense, which I don't like to use because nobody's ever heard of that. So I call it the associative sense. It means the same thing. But it says, I call it associative because that's, in effect, what we do, is that when we see something particular, we immediately associate with whatever we're seeing our past history, all the associations that we have from our past life. And so whenever we see an individual thing, we immediately, spontaneously, judge it, in a sense, as being of value, of being good or bad, positive or negative, in accordance with our history and our habits. And we can't not do this because it happens spontaneously. So, for example, just even in the simplest way, we see a piece of delicious, chocolate cake. And we immediately, we don't just see it as a brown thing, but we immediately associate how nice it would be to eat it, or whatever associations we've formed with it from our past life. Right? And so we don't see things as, neutral. But everything that we perceive as filled with some kind of value. And we also associate, when we see a particular thing, we associate our past experience, and we also associate what we know right? Through whatever we've learned. And that's this has to do with the fact that we're rational animals. And this is what makes art possible. Right? When we look at an artwork, we go to the museum, we see a particular thing, a particular painting or statue, and we immediately associate to that we see all kinds of things from our past life. For example, I look at a crucifix. I immediately associate what I know about it, that it represents Christ dying for me, and I associate all kinds of things with the way it's portrayed, with its color, with its... and that's proper to man. Only man can do that. We see a particular thing, and yet we associate to it our concepts and our history. And that's why, essentially, what the artist is seeking to do is to create objects that have whose associations convey what he wants to convey.
All before thinking.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly. And next week we're going to talk about the intellect, about reason, how we understand things. But we could just say now that this associative sense is the foundation for understanding. Because when we understand something, we abstract, we pull out the ideas from these associations that we form through our internal sense of association. And above all, the most important thing that we pull out is we pull out moral principles. We'll talk about that next time. And what's the organ of this? Well, it's the brain. Right? The brain is the organ of this associative sense. And that's why man's brain is so much larger than any other species. Right? Because we use these associations precisely as the foundation for our concepts, for our ideas, for our intellect. And we'll talk about that next time. Okay, one last interior sense. Not only can we grasp the values of particular things, but we retain it. No, we store it up, and we call that memory. So memory is retaining the experiences that we've formed, positive or negative, good or bad, in such a way that we can still possess them, and we can search through them and learn from them, so that we can use that to direct ourselves in the future. Right? And animals can do this to a certain extent, insofar as they can learn and be trained. No, but man does it in a far higher way. Right? We can understand our own history through memory. Okay, and all of these things, what we see is that man is the intersection. Right? We're joined to the physical world by having bodies, by having vegetative functions like plants, by having senses like the animals, external senses and also internal senses. But in man, all of that is elevated by our intellect and will, and raised so that we can raise it up to the spiritual world, and ultimately to God. And so our place in creation is crucial. No, we're the center. We're the point of union between the material and the spiritual. And everything in man shows that place. And all of our activities show that place. And ultimately the purpose of it is that man can bring up to God, in a certain sense, the physical world by ordering our lives to God. Let's take our break here, and then we'll have questions and answers. I imagine there'll be questions after this abstract. It'll get easier.